Good morning. It's very early morning for some of us. It's a pleasure to be back at Sachs Neuroscience. And I've titled this talk, Life After Aduhelm. Now, by the end of 2023, Aduhelm will be irrelevant other than as a cautionary tale, a case study probably for many years to come for MBA programs everywhere. Damaged the reputation and future of the single most important company in neuroscience. Best guess estimate of the cost so far, over $12 billion. For platinum pricing mediocrity, and parenthetically, I think the largest or the most major egregious unforced error that I've seen in 27 years was the pricing of Aduhelm at $56,000 a year. One must wonder, had they priced it at $5,000, whether all this angst would have eventuated. So after having damaged the reputation of the FDA, after having revived a questionable at best, or at least somewhat difficult mechanistic hypothesis, and after damaging the credibility of the pharma industry, which does not have credibility to spare, and having breathed new life into old programs from Lilly, Eisai, and Roche. And Lilly seems to be the consensus candidate for getting the biggest advantage for donanemab. It is, to put it mildly, the worst launch ever. Alzheimer's life after Aduhelm will begin with micro progress. The other MABs appear slightly less mediocre, certainly probably somewhat safer. Tau MABs have thus far missed their target, and the off the beaten track entrants seem to be more hype than hope. Comments on some other novel mechanisms. The infection hypothesis that drove Cortexime. A question that arises, that Cortexime failed in their phase 2b, but they had a signal in the 38% of the sample that was P. gingivalis positive. Since that was the target, why wasn't this an inclusion criterion? Why did they enroll people that were P. gingivalis negative in that trial? Filament A, cassava science, and I'm not going to delve into the controversies around cassava's alleged transgressions. Suffice it to say, their first placebo-controlled trial is labeled a phase 3. Cognition Therapeutics, Sigma 2, has done extraordinarily well at using the NIH fund to get as far as they have. TheraPharma, novel MOA, data at the end of 2022. And the overall umbrella category of neuroinflammation seems to be the hottest topic, with targets like TREM2 and RAPK1. Worth noting that AbbVie and Elector already ran into a problem with E4 homozygotes, where ARIA was developing to excess, and they've had to exclude those patients from their trial. Now, the beachhead approach to neurodegeneration has been a popular topic of late, starting with a genetic subgroup and hoping to be able to expand from there. It's not always easily done. The genetic hypothesis did not work, at least thus far, for tominersen and Huntington's. Now, they claim that a post hoc subgroup analysis shows a population that might be treatment responsive. It seems like data mining, and that does not always prove to be predictive. SOD1 ALS, tofersen failed, but they think they may have seen a signal. C9orf72, GSK Elector. Now, this is actually a preservative error. This is FTD with this genetic flaw. But they showed some positive trends in phase 2A, although that was an open label trial. And ALS C9orf72, Biogen Ionis will have some 1B data next year. The GBA subgroup of Parkinson's, promising subgroup differentiation. Lillian Prevail ran into some immunoreactivity problems early on and have had to make their phase 1/2 open label. And BL Bio will have their oral drug going into phase 2 during the second half of this year. And finally, the progranulin mutation form of FTD, GSK and Elector, and GSK thought this program worth spending $700 million up front to partner. Phase 3 results next year. Takeda and Denali in phase 1, and Arcuda has a small molecule in IND preparation. I found this provocative. I suspect I'm not the only person who did. A few weeks ago in the New York Times, Alan Francis, a prominent psychiatrist and the main force behind DSM-4, said that the last 30 years of neuroscience, an exciting intellectual adventure, but it hasn't helped a single patient. Well, that's almost bizarrely false. Many programs have failed, but many have directly benefited patients. And it's worth noting that. Some success stories of the last 5 years: spinal muscular atrophy, which was untreatable, now has 3 effective disease-modifying options available. Migraine prophylaxis, CGRP antagonism, has become a highly active area for a number of companies. Bipolar depression, which had been an afterthought for many years, with Synovian leading the way to developing a drug for bipolar depression, other companies following suit. Rapid-acting antidepressant, esketamine from J&J, an effective treatment for postpartum depression, Zulresso from Sage. Now, those 2 programs show that you can have clinical efficacy without commercial success, although for both of them, the pandemic played an important role in that. Katie and Neuron have reported phase 3 data for an effective drug for Rett syndrome. Zogenix and GW Pharma successfully reduced seizure frequency in Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut. Marinus just received approval for a rare pediatric epilepsy. And Acadia developed an antipsychotic alternative for Parkinsonian psychosis. We have a cascade of clinical readouts that has begun. It actually extends beyond 2023 into 24-25, but I'm going to focus on this year and next. First of all, psychiatry, hint of concept and proof of concept trials. First, zuranolone just recently reported its most latest phase 3 data, and I'm going to talk about that more in a couple minutes. He also should have postpartum depression phase 3 data, and based on brexanolone's success, one would anticipate that being successful. Neumora with Blackthorn's kappa opioid antagonist, Neurocrine with a couple of novel mechanisms that they obtained from Takeda, mTOR target, a couple from Janssen. And the ones that are in red down the bottom are under the loosely defined psychedelics category. Small Pharma will have the first controlled data for DMT, a rapid-acting psychedelic, and Atai with Perception will have phase 2 data for R-ketamine, the other enantiomer of ketamine in TRD. Schizophrenia. Karuna and Synovian with Otsuka will have phase 3 results for new drugs, new mechanisms in the treatment of schizophrenia, an area that is badly in need of them. A couple other schizophrenia mechanisms being tested now, a few PTSD programs, one of which is a second phase 3 for MAPS, the MDMA and PTSD program. They were successful to an unexpected degree in the first phase 3, and I don't expect anything different from the second. And down the bottom, I've highlighted Atai and Demerex, mainly because addiction is an area that the industry has sadly neglected given its societal prominence. Ibogaine is a botanical quasi-psychedelic that has anecdotal reports of utility in addiction for hundreds, if not thousands of patients, but almost no controlled data. This will be the first solid phase 2 trial to see if this is truly a useful advance. And in neurology, in Alzheimer's, you've got AbbVie and Elector with the TREM2 program. AbbVie just acquired Syndisi, which has a promising pro-cognitive mechanism. We're now in phase 1B, both for Alzheimer's MCI and also in depression MCI. Cassava with Simufilam in phase 3, and then a number of other programs, including 3 other amyloid MABs, all trying to get to the finish line. I suspect that they may not throw themselves in the tender mercies of CMS Medicare in the hope of accelerated approval. They're all close enough to efficacy data that they may rely upon the old standard of functional benefit. Other neurodegeneration data points coming. I already mentioned GSK and Elector with their Sortilin MAB, phase 3 data next year. Cerevel has a novel approach to Parkinsonian symptomatology with tavapadon in phase 3. Something that we haven't heard much of in recent years, many years actually, a neuroprotectant for stroke. Nono has the phase 3 data coming with its second phase 3. The first one failed, but I think they actually did identify a key factor, and this phase 3 has a reasonably good chance of success in an area that has also been sadly neglected by the pharma industry. And down the bottom, I have a little check mark next to Sage. They ran a very small pilot study in Parkinsonian cognition. That, along with Huntington's cognition, they've had 2 positive but very tiny pilot studies for 718. A few pain programs generating data in the next year or 2, and a couple of epilepsy programs as well. What's going to happen to Biogen? Why does that matter? Well, this chart shows the number of in-licensings completed between 2010 and 2021. As you can see, the number that have been completed by Biogen far outstrips any other company. They have been the most prolific of licensing partners. Even more dramatic is the amount of money that they've put into small companies via upfront payments. Now, it should be noted that some of these other companies are very shy about revealing upfront payments, not generally because they're so generous, but even if this is a 50% underestimate of what they've actually put out, they still fall far behind Biogen, which has invested over $5 billion over the past 11 years in upfront payments. Fixing Biogen. The general talk nowadays is they need to merge or acquire something. Apparently they turned down the opportunity to go after Neurocrine Biosciences. At this point, they might have to consider something larger scale. And I've trademarked a few potential corporate names for merged entities: Takeda, BioJerk, and AstraZeneca. Biogen is banking, along with Sage, on zuranolone being a viable antidepressant. Zuranolone has some problems with sedation and somnolence. It also relies upon an intermittent dosing paradigm, 2 weeks on and then at least 6 weeks or more off, something that most prescribers are not used to. It does have a rapid onset of effect within 3 days, and about 50% of patients who receive zuranolone for 2 weeks in an extension study did not need retreatment over the following 12 months. So it does suggest that for some patients, it may be a durable impact. Where is zuranolone going to fall? Well, part of that is determined by an interesting feature that I noted in the last phase 3. This is the comparison of subgroups without elevated anxiety going in. As you can see, those lines barely separate and not for very long. Contrast that with the impact in patients who did have high anxiety at baseline. Separation is almost immediate. It reaches statistical significance at a couple points in spite of the fact these are small samples. It showed some durability, although it was starting to dissipate by day 42. It does suggest that zuranolone's position may be in a niche for patients who have prominent anxiety, for whom rapid relief is a high priority, and interestingly, prefer to think of their mood disorder as a transient state, not an ongoing trait. The idea of taking medication just for 2 weeks may be more acceptable to some patients, particularly men. Could be very attractive to people who want to avoid SSRI AEs, particularly sexual dysfunction. And it will rely upon prescribers who are willing to adapt to an intermittent dosing paradigm. However, should we know that at least 8 other novel antidepressant mechanisms will have hint of concept or proof of concept data in the next 2 years. So there will be competition in this space. Stroke. This is an underappreciated asset that Biogen has. And I think potentially far more important, even though it's not sexy, it's not gene therapy, they're not manipulating RNA, it's a thrombolytic. Thrombolysis has been established as a treatment standard for ischemic stroke for the last almost 30 years. The problem is that TPA has a treatment window of 3 to 4, maybe 4.5 hours maximum post-stroke, which means that by the time that people have had CT clearance to rule out hemorrhagic stroke, only 3 to 5% of stroke patients are even eligible. The TMS thrombolytic has a 12-hour window. In phase 2, it was a 9.5-hour mean. And those patients who received that thrombolytic had more than double the probability of no or minimal disability at 90 days. 12-hour window means a majority can receive thrombolysis. And there are 800,000 strokes in the US every year. This is not a small market, and this is not a minor product. CNS money and where it's been going. There were some well-funded umbrellas, companies that were in some ways were emulating BridgeBio's approach to assembling a disparate portfolio. Neumora, $500 million series. Nervati, several hundred million. And Atai, which many people don't think of as an umbrella company, but in fact has a number of non-psychedelic options, including in addition to its psychedelic menu. I show the slide every year to reiterate the point that the funding environment for CNS has changed dramatically over the last few years. You can see the flat line that existed up to 2014 for both institutional investment, that's the blue line, and for partnering up fronts, the red line. The gray is the sum. Things started to turn around in 2014, 2015, although there have been fluctuations. You can see by 2020, the total exceeded $11 billion, which is a far cry from the under $1 billion, which that was the case in 2010. Now, they were off about 30% last year, and so far, one would have to think it might be off again this year. Priorities for institutional investors: disease modification in neurology, i.e. neurodegeneration, number one area. Psychiatry has continued to be surprisingly strong, given the fact that it was anathema for many years during the 2010s. The other two categories falling quite a bit behind. Partnering upfronts. Disease modification neurology, by far the most popular emphasis for partnerships by larger companies. That's what they are turning to small companies for. The other three areas, well back, I would have to say the pain area is somewhat artificially boosted here due to a Pfizer Biogen agreement, marketing agreement. Otherwise, pain tends to fall into fourth place. "2022 thus far, grim, really quite grim. During the first 2 months, total CNS institutional investment was down 9% from last year, but that includes two large rounds, one secondary offering, one IPO. If you parse those out, developmental stage investment is down 89% compared to last year. As of mid-March, year-to-date mean stock price across all CNS-focused companies, minus 14%, and 19 had lost 25% or more of the value in just 10 weeks. And the annualized pace of partnering down 23% from last year. Ample cash on the sidelines, but in this current environment, clinical disappointments can be fatal. There's little room for error. Psychedelic therapeutics, a hot topic of late. First the fever, then the data, then the hangover. By fever, I refer to that red line there, which is the line for institutional investment in psychedelics. Now, compare that with the blue line, which is the investment in gene therapies for CNS. That had steadily climbed for several years before declining somewhat in 2021. Institutional investment in psychedelics was non-existent, essentially until 2020. Yet last year, and it's almost hard to believe I'm saying this, the institutional investment in psychedelic therapeutics was almost as much as went into CNS gene therapies. Now, the green line is partnering upfronts for gene therapies. That dropped off after a very active couple of years. There is no line for psychedelic partnerships, which has been essentially non-existent, other than one very small Otsuka deal. Data. Compass's psilocybin phase 2b produced remission in 25% of TRD patients. One drug session, limited prep and integration of therapy. From a clinical viewpoint, that's a success in a treatment refractory population. But because expectations, I think, about the whole psychedelics arena had gotten blown out of proportion, this is perceived as a letdown. Compass's valuation down 74% since the beginning of 2021. Atai and MindMed down almost as much. I think the problem is that psychedelic options are not going to be panaceas. I do believe that they are going to be effective tools for some psychiatric disorders. Back in the 60s, turn on, tune in, drop out was some bad advice. There are some new bad ideas we found in the psychedelic therapies movement. LSD for anything, given its very extended duration of effect, particularly for ADHD or for Alzheimer's. Now, on the other side, other end of the duration spectrum, DMT and 5-MeO DMT, 20 to 30 minute treatment duration, that actually may be an onset within 30 seconds, depending on the mode of ingestion, may simply be too fast, too anxiogenic, and maybe not sufficient to effectively reconfigure the default mode. I think there will be a sweet spot between the very quick psychedelics and even the fairly relatively lengthier psilocybin impact. Yet to be defined what the optimal session prep and integration process should be, what the duration, intensity, and redosing protocols should be, and for what patients this will be appropriate. This could be ending up a class of interventions to the 1%, unless more efficient protocols can be devised, perhaps using digital therapeutic supplements to augment what is a very expensive psychotherapeutic component. Psychedelics area is in its infancy, and I had written originally the culling will start this year. It's already started. The company MindCure, which was very confused about what its mission was, just shut its doors. Now, despite the current angst about fiscal resources, it is a down cycle. There are some CNS successes brewing. Negative symptom improvement in schizophrenia, a transformative treatment for PTSD, transformative treatment for TRD, improved thrombolysis for ischemic stroke, and finally, a neuroprotectant for ischemic stroke. Improved Parkinson's symptom control and disease modification in FTD PGRN. Now, our hit rate has actually improved. There may be some negative surprises yet to come. There will be, inevitably. I look back at a presentation I did in 2014 where I listed 12 data points that were going to be coming in the next year. 11 of them were failures. 2016, I went back and looked at some predictions about treatment paradigm shifts from novel mechanisms over the next 3 years. The hit rate was maybe 20%. We're getting better at this because our tools are getting better and we're showing a more intelligent parsing of patient populations. What is unclear at this point, and this is cyclical, is how responsive investors will be to good news. At this point, I think there's the risk that they will over-respond to any negative findings and perhaps under-respond to good news. This does not change the overall trajectory of the CNS sector, which is of considerable improvement and prospects for the next few years for introducing additional highly beneficial options for psychiatric and neurological disorders. And that is it.